I'm Dick Lindahl. I work with the Adult Education Committee, and I want to introduce Ed Williams. He's our guest presenter today, and Ed has worked for what, 5 years or something like that with Searchlight, New Mexico, and he's going to make a very interesting presentation today about foster children in the state system. And he mentioned to me just now that it's very hard to dig into this topic because of the state keeps very much secretive data. Part of it is state confidentiality statutes, but it's really hard to dig out what's actually happening with these kids. So without any more ado, I'll introduce Ed.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Williams. Yeah, so I've been at Searchlight, New Mexico for about since 2018. So I guess that's 5 years now. And I've been in the journalism for much longer than that. But Searchlight is an organization that was founded in order to address, in an investigative journalism way, the New Mexico's many problems with child well-being. And everyone probably knows that we're last in the country for child poverty, drug abuse, all of these things that make like child welfare in general a harder thing for kids here than anywhere else in the country. Sometimes we toggle back and forth with Mississippi, but for the most part, we're the worst. There's a saying in New Mexico, child welfare world, that thank God for Mississippi, because otherwise we'd be alone, because we're so far removed, those two states, from the next worst place. I mean, it's just awful. And so we were founded by Ray Rivera, who was then the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican. He since went to the Seattle Times, and now he runs the USA Today network for the Sun Belt. And so my focus from the beginning has been on the foster care system. I've, diverted every now and then. I spend a year on education and special education, but mostly I've been writing about CYFD, the Children and Families Department, which is a department in the state that is responsible for overseeing the safety and welfare of all of the kids in the foster system. And more than that, the juvenile justice system is also run by CYFD. And it's an agency that is just plagued with problems. I mean, there's so many skeletons in this department's closet, it's unbelievable. And if anyone reads the newspaper here, they'll see one case of child abuse after another. And in every single one of those cases you see in the news, there are questions about why didn't the state see this coming? There are all these red flags. Why did they put the kid back in the case of the abuser? These kinds of things. But for this series, I wanted to focus on a group that nobody ever hears about, which is the teenagers in the foster system. I mean, who is more vulnerable? Who needs more help? Who's had a harder time than the kids who have been in the system their whole life and now, are about to age out? I don't know if I've ever seen any coverage of this group because they're the hardest to find. Any teenager at all, even one from a good background, is hard to write about. Okay. So any teenager is hard, to write about. Investigative journalism takes a lot of work. I mean, one story can take 6 months, sometimes more, to do, and like what teenager is going to stick with you throughout that process. So we had to figure out a way to get at this population and to find out what was going on. And the background is that back in 2018. The state started shutting down its residential treatment centers for adolescents. These are like the facilities that are basically like mental institutions. There were all kinds of problems there. There was, cases of abuse, all kinds of, lawsuits and state investigations. And then there was a federal law called the Family First Act, which, incentivized states to move away from this kind of treatment for kids. It wasn't a great place. And what would happen a lot of times is the state would just, lock their problematic kids in these facilities and, wash their hands of them. And they would not get better there. So as part of that effort to shut them down, and also a big lawsuit called the Kevin S. suit, which was filed in 2018 and settled in 2020 in New Mexico, the state was supposed to create a new system of mental health care services, like outpatient services that all these kids could access. And it was also supposed to place all these kids in foster homes because, if you're living, on the streets or in a facility, you can't really, that mental health care doesn't work. And so I knew that the state had closed down its main residential treatment centers, one called Desert Hills, there's another one called YHA. Basically, they're all gone now as a result of this like state enforcement push to shut them down. But it had not built any of these new mental health care systems, right? And it did not put the kids in foster care. That I knew from my previous reporting. So the question was, like, where are all these kids? Where are these teenagers that would have been previously in these RTCs, but now they're gone? So I wanted to find where they were. So I partnered with ProPublica, which is a news organization out of New York. They're really good journalists there. Their most recent expose was the Clarence Thomas stories about all of his flirtings with the billionaire Harlan Crow, and we worked together to find find these kids and to figure out where to go. Like we mentioned earlier, kids' documents are secret. The state doesn't share data even when it's supposed to. This department is extremely secretive, and it's secretive in order to protect itself, not to protect the kids. Even though a lot of times it'll say we can't share this data because it would, it would compromise the priority of the kids. I mean, the privacy of the kids. So this is the series that we ended up running. We called it Nowhere to Go. We through my reporting, I basically, I interviewed all kinds of kids that I knew in the system from previous stories, the lawyers, and we ended up finding that the state had put these kids into homeless shelters instead of the mental health treatment, the foster homes that they were finding. Like, this is where we ended up finding this group of teenagers. There's about 50 of them. It's what the state considers their hard to place youth. Kids with complex, trauma-related mental health issues, things like PTSD, depression, suicidal, violent behavior, things that really need intensive mental health intervention. The state's not giving it to them, and so we had to figure out. We know they're in homeless shelters. How do we, how do we document this? Because we can't just have a story in investigative journalism that says this is what people say. We've noticed a lot of these kids are in homeless shelters. What we did was basically at the first of the year last year, this series took about a year and 4 months to finish, and actually there's probably going to be more on it soon. We ended up basically embedding in some of the drop-in youth shelters in Albuquerque. There are places, the homeless shelters are confidential. You can't go in there because they're like, they're good for good reason. The kids are, need privacy, and they can't have journalism, like journalists or others, like inside the shelters where they are. But there are drop-in centers where after hours or during, any time of the day, really, the kids can go like play video games, just hang out. Kids, not just in shelters, but everywhere. We knew there was a lot of crossover. And so we ended up finding a kid named Jadrian Platero. This is him at one of those shelters that was willing to talk to us. Actually, he was like the 4th or 5th kid that we identified that we wanted to write a story about that embodied this problem. But each time, like, a kid would disappear or change their mind, or we'd lose them somehow. And he was the only one that was able to stick through this process. And the process is hard. I mean, we need find your attorney. We need to file sometimes motions with children's court or to get their attorneys to do it, to release data, to release documents, so we can have, actual documentation about where this kid was in the system and what happened based on the documentation, aligns with what should have happened or what the law says. So what we found in this kid's case is that we translated it to Navajo because he was Navajo. He was living with his mom in a hotel in Farmington. and ended up having like a really dramatic suicide attempt where, there were 30 or 40 police. We got all the videos. They were, pointing their assault rifles. There was a helicopter circling up above. He was 16 years old. And, before the police could fire their stun guns and subdue him, he ended up stabbing himself in the neck like 5 or 6 times. The state took him to the hospital, released him from the hospital, and took him straight to a psychiatric hospital in Las Cruces. He was there for about 2 weeks and then released. His caseworker picked him up, drove him from the psychiatric hospital straight to a homeless shelter and just dropped him there. And that's where he spent the rest of his teenage years. This is unfortunately not, it's not unusual. It's what happens a lot. This is like the beds where these kids sleep. These facilities aren't like bad facilities. If you read the story, you can find them all at searchlight.org. It's not as if these homeless shelters are the problem. The problem is that these were set up to, house a kid for a day or two, a week max. Runaways who have nowhere else to go. You can get a roof over your head, maybe a counselor, some meals. There's a basketball court, but they're not set up for a kid who really needs psychiatric help. And we found that they're, home now for the state's most troubled kids. The CYFD is allowed to use these homeless shelters and foster placements in what's called extraordinary circumstances, which basically means if somehow putting them there would protect their life. You know what I mean? Maybe someone's out, there's a kid who's a trafficking victim, and the traffickers are actively looking for them. And if they put them in a shelter for a night or two, maybe they'll be safe there while they figure something else out. That could be an extraordinary circumstance. But like I said, we found that it was absolutely routine, that it was happening all the time, and that the kids, once there, were having one crisis after another, and doing this thing called the shelter shuffle, which is where a kid will go into one shelter, will have a mental breakdown because there's no services, and CYFD will pick them up and sometimes drive them directly to another shelter where that happens again and again and again and again. So this is a shelter in Albuquerque called New Day. It's one of the biggest ones, and one of the ones where the most problems were found. I mean, so to get this data, what we had to do, since it's secret from the state, is find where there have been 911 calls regarding these kids. So we sent records requests to the corresponding to the address of every shelter in the state that had a contract with CYFD, and got what are called computer assisted dispatch logs. These are like anytime you call 911, there's basically a computer transcript of that call, and that's a public record. So we used that to basically find all of the calls that had come from these shelters over a period of 3 years from 2019 to the present, actually mid 2022. It's funny because we had to be kind of retrospective with this because we started in 2019, or we started in 2020, and then had to go back a year. But by the time we finished, it takes so long to get these records that they were a little bit dated. But we were able to show that these problems are still happening. So we got those records and we used those to find which ones have foster kids. Most of the time, the police will specify that this is a CYFD kid because part of the protocol is that they need to call the state and file what's called a Sky report, which is like anytime there's something happens with a foster kid in the police, they have to file this report. So that's noted in the logs. We could use those to get incident reports, which contain the police narratives. We could use those to get, to drill down further and get 911 audio recordings and police body camera video. And those together really painted a very clear picture of, this cycle of the shelter shuffle, shelter placement, mental health crisis, followed by another one and another one and another one. And by the way, if anyone has questions while I'm talking, please let me know. So we let's see. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So this, this first story was just, we wanted to really paint a picture of one child's experience with the system. Thankfully, Jadrian at last we looked, was doing okay. He was living in a transitional housing unit that was, funded by the state, that was also operated by one of the shelters where he was living. He was trying to get his GED. His mother, this is a picture of his mom. I'm sure you guys have heard the, epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. His mom disappeared. He never, that's why he was in custody, because he didn't know what happened to her, and she just kind of fell off the face of the earth. It's a big problem in the state. Well, not just in the state, but in the whole country. So this, another problem that we identified as part of this, this cycle, is that while the kids are waiting for a shelter placement, the caseworkers are just frantically dialing 911 over and over again, begging the shelters to please take this kid. The shelters can say no, and a lot of times they do. So while that's happening, the kids are basically living in the office building of the CYFD's Albuquerque headquarters, which is like on Indian School in Albuquerque. And while there, there's a whole lot of horrible things that are happening. We found, I can't remember the number, but dozens of calls to 911 from the office itself, from CYFD workers calling police on these kids. In some cases, trying to press charges against them. In some cases, trying to get police to arrest them because they didn't want them in the office and nowhere else would take them. So can you please take them to jail? Usually that doesn't happen because it's hard to take a juvenile to jail. It's a really serious charge. But in December, there was a kid with really problematic sexual aggression that was placed in this in the office in Albuquerque with another kid who was a victim of sexual assault previously, which is why he was in custody. And then there was a sexual assault that happened at the office of CYFD in the room across from where the secretary of the department's headquarters is where these kids were living. And this was a pretty explosive story. The legislature opened its session this year talking about this on the floor of the House. This preceded the governor's announcement of an executive order to overhaul the agency. I'm really doubtful about the success that will have. But we found that this kid that was the perpetrator of this assault was one of these very kids who we were writing about, who was bouncing from one shelter to another without any mental health care. There was RTC previously based in Los Lunas that was set up to deal with a specific kind of behavior, and the state closed that down. So now these kids with this kind of behavior problem have nowhere to go. And instead, they're milling around with other kids, and it's just a kind of a problem waiting to happen. So this is a picture of the office space where the kids are living, which we got through an employee of the department who shared it with us confidentially. Well, not confidentially, we just couldn't say where it came from. But these kids are sometimes spending weeks or months living on an office space couch. Teenagers with can you imagine how frustrating that would be? And so trying to find the back button. Here we are. And so this is the final. I'm just skipping over some of these. I mean, there were some stories about the Kevin S. settlement where there were rules in place to make these only extraordinary circumstances placements, like I mentioned. After our reporting, that a panel of experts in that case did an audit and found that indeed, just like we said, CYFD was breaking this law, well, not a law, but an agreement over and over and over again, putting kids in shelters as a first resort instead of a last resort. This is the final story that we had. We published it recently, and it ran in the New Mexican as well, so you might have seen it there if you read the local paper. But this was just a really, we wanted to show beyond the story of that one kid, Jadrian, just kind of writ large, the cycle that happens to these kids. And the data that we had, I mean, like I said, was very, very clear. We found 1,100 instances of 911 calls from shelters, mostly involving foster kids, meaning that like over the period that we analyzed, basically every single day, someone in the shelter called the police to come intervene with a foster kid. Shelters say that they call 911 as a last resort, but and that's probably true. I mean, much more problems that occur in these shelters than we know about from the police logs. But this is a girl who was one of the most prominent, figures in the data. She came up over and over again. She was 16 years old at this time. She had had 30 911 calls at I can't remember how many different shelters over a period of 1 year. Just all the time, several times a month, the police were coming to either arrest her or take her for a psychiatric evaluation. And during that time, it didn't appear that she had any sort of foster placement. She was just living in shelters. She'd have an emergency. The police would come, arrest her, and then, release her back to a shelter. Sometimes the cops would have to drive directly these kids to another shelter. So they're literally transporting foster kids in the back of police cars like prisoners, and, opening the door and saying they live in this homeless shelter. Not that it's the police's fault, they're just doing what the CYP caseworker says, that they don't have jurisdiction over the kid itself. They have to wait for the guardian to give them, an idea of what to do. So we thought this was a really clear example of the harm, of the danger of this kind of system where police are intervening on, for sometimes minor incidents. In this case, she and another foster kid had run away. We found 650 instances of this happening over the period that we looked at. From the homeless shelter, she had just run with another kid to a gas station. She was hoping to get back to Albuquerque, where her boyfriend was. And the cops came to the shelter, called 911 to report the missing kids. And they found the kids at a gas station. And when they found them, the kids got aggressive, pushed the police officers when they tried to grab them to take them back to the shelter. And then they ended up putting them in this, what's called a wrap restraint. It's like a straight jacket. I mean, it's just a full body restraint. You have a foam helmet on your head, and they just stuck her in the back of a police car in this device, and took her to the hospital, and then released her back to the same shelter that same night. Then the next morning, she ran away again, and the police again came. But, we spoke a lot with Dr. George Davis, who was the former head of psychiatry for CYFD, and, how he explained it is it's inevitable that this is going to happen because these kids, it's a survival response to lash out. When a police officer or anyone tries to grab them or something, of course, they're going to, push or fight back or try to run. It's just, psychologically, that's what people do in that kind of scenario, especially children. So what you end up happening is kids getting serious juvenile rap sheets. This girl had, assault on a police officer from this incident, and she, she turned 18 with a long juvenile record. So, but a big part of the story here is that the police themselves, here's some numbers, 1,100 calls regarding shelter residents, 460 for physical violence, disorderly conduct, or mental health crises. That includes more than 70 calls for suicidal youth, and at least 650 calls for runaway. So these are not small numbers of these incidents happening, right? Especially when you think about, we're really talking about 50 children, right? I mean, it's really unbelievable. So the police themselves are really bogged down trying to deal with this, and it's extremely frustrating for them. A lot of times, we only got one agency to actually agree to an interview about this, which was the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office. Other police wouldn't comment because they didn't want to get crosswise with CYFD, but you could see in the body camera video, these are all stills from police lapel cameras. that the police would be talking about how frustrating this is, how this happens all the time, how CYFD needs to do its job, how, oh great, it's the same kid once again. And the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, of course, this is the biggest sheriff's department in the state, told us that every single deputy had responded at least once to the shelter in that jurisdiction. There's only one, this one here on the side. And they, said that it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, they can sit for sometimes 5 hours waiting for a CYFD worker to come and intervene, tell them what to do with this kid. In the meantime, that officer is unable to, respond to emergencies elsewhere. So it's leading to slowing down response times to other emergencies in every jurisdiction where this is happening. And let's see if I can find the quote. So this is what the Lieutenant Amy Dudowitz at the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department said. She's the one that deals with this kind of incident the most. I can't remember her specific title, but I think it's crisis intervention officer, supervising officer, something like that. So she's saying, so now we're waiting. We're waiting for somebody to show up that can make a decision about this kid's care. It's a frustration and it's a huge concern for those of us who are answering those calls. Like, is this the best response that we have to offer? So the cops themselves know that they're not the ones that are supposed to be intervening with these kids, but instead of mental health professionals coming when a kid is having a mental breakdown in the shelter, it's police officers, and just all the cascading problems that occur with that are extremely, extremely predictable. And also in a lot of these instances, we see the shelters themselves, the staff, like in extreme danger from these kids. I have I can play this, I guess. It's pretty intense. Do you guys want to hear it?
Yeah. Yeah. Have you shared the sound?
I think we did, right? Shared the sound.
Shared the sound.
Okay. This is an example of a shelter in Santa Fe where a kid was placed who had just stolen a car and assaulted a police officer at the CYFD office. So the caseworkers knew that this happened, right? Like, they knew that this kid was a liability, but they didn't tell the shelters that this kid had a parole officer. They didn't tell them about the history, right? So this is something we found happens a lot. Every shelter that we interviewed, which was all of them, they all said that regularly CYFD would refer kids to them and omit important information about their mental health, whether they have like a suicidal history or a history of, violent behavior or something like that. And, the shelters say, it's not that we would reject a referral because of this, but we could make plans. We could try to do something to fix it or to protect that kid and the other kids around him or her. But I think CYFD just feels like maybe the kid, we have nowhere for this kid to go. And maybe if we don't, yeah.
I just wanted to say I was a CASA worker, and I found one of the problems was the reason they sued the department didn't share information because the social workers would write it up, it had to be typed, and then it had to be shared, and it was just a backlog. So in working with CASA, I never got the information I needed to have.
Yeah.
It was just a backlog.
That's a great example. The court-appointed special advocates are another important part of this system, and nobody's getting information, right? But I mean, these are acute cases, which is the problem. These are kids who are suicidal. They might literally try to kill themselves in the shelter, but they put them there anyway and don't give the shelter the information. We have a specific story.
We also have Nat Dean who would like to say something. Go ahead, Nat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing the series of articles. I read them when they came out, and they were excellent and very illustrative of the issues. There's a model out of San Francisco that's been in place for, I just was going back and making sure it still existed, for over 50 years, called Huckleberry House. Have you ever heard of that program?
That's in the Bay Area, right?
Yes, in San Francisco Bay Area, which has it's of course, a more urban setting, but they would try to find a home setting for a runaway or a potential runaway with a family. And I was one of the foster parents in that system where they could live in a family setting for a few days with a family where the adults or other children had areas of interest to the runaway or runaway risk. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit ill this morning, so I'm a little bit less articulate than I would like to be. And by placing the runaway in a setting where there was an interest that they had for potential life direction, which in my case, I was in the arts, you were with the person, the runaway, the entire time, and helping sort of show them some hope for a possible career direction. And it was very successful. I fostered for up to 5 days because that was the limit, about 6 different youth, and would say, hey, you want to like do a Star Wars movie, which was brand new at the time. Like, we can call George Lucas, and kind of give them hope that there's a pathway. But it was getting out of that cyclical, there's no hope, there's nothing for me, I don't have any direction, and no one would ever want me kind of thing. It's a small piece of their model program, but it's apparently still in existence because I've been gone from the Bay Area for over 30 years myself. But thank you for the incredible investigative reporting that Searchlight does, and for your
Thank you.
contributions for the last 5 years.
Thanks
You're
so
an
much.
excellent
That is-
documentarian.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are elements, unfortunately, people always ask, where is doing this right? We seem to be doing this worse than anywhere else, but no state has it perfect. But there are places like that program that you mentioned, and New York City has another one that have really, promising, and some of them are working really well programs. And New Mexico is supposed to be implementing a lot of that in this Kevin S. settlement. But the New York Times had a big story on how groundbreaking the state would be if it, under this settlement that it agreed to. And some of the stuff that they're supposed to be doing is just what you said, is keeping the kids in the area where they're from and having them, in foster homes rather than in facilities. And that's just, the state hasn't followed through at all. In fact, in the last audit of the progress in that settlement, I think we met 11 out of 50 or something like that, targets that we were supposed to have. And those 11 targets were just kind of procedural things like, CYFD will create a new, form of some kind, or, paperwork stuff for the most part. I mean, and so we have a long way to go, but hopefully if the state ever does follow through with this settlement, we'll be able to emulate some of that stuff that other states are doing well. So I'm going to go ahead and play this.
Thank you for being such a large part of the solution. I often feel the same way about New Mexico. We're kind of in this vortex that keeps going down the drain instead of a vortex that lifts people up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Santa Fe 911, what's the location of the emergency?
What's the phone number?
What's
I'm
the
sorry,
location?
The location is the Youth Emergency Shelter,
Okay.
5686
Okay,
Freya Street.
tell me exactly what happened.
We have a client who has been destroying property and is now seriously threatening bodily harm with one of the coworkers.
Okay. Is this gonna be for,
Yes.
okay. Does he
It's
need an
escalating.
ambulance?
Not at this point, but he's throwing. Yeah, I hope it doesn't get.
What is he doing?
He's been threatening to. Oh fuck. Yeah, we need people here now.
Ma'am.
He's breaking glass.
He's breaking glass?
Yeah. Holy shit. Seriously?
Okay, what's he doing?
Okay. Okay, we need some help. now.
I understand. What is he doing, ma'am?
He's breaking windows. He's cut now.
He's cut now?
Yep. There's glass everywhere.
Okay.
That's like one small snippet of many calls that we had. The hard thing is a lot of times they're saying the kid's name, right? And so we bleeped it out there. We don't want to identify these kids, even though they're public records in a news story. So like I said, this is an example of a kid that had a clear pattern that needed help with this behavior, but instead was put into a shelter without any sort of background. And the shelter manager said, like, if we had known about this, we would have taken steps. Maybe we could have helped him. But they didn't. Here's the damage to inside the shelter. And then they found the kid in the field and took him to jail and charged him with aggravated assault. And now he's, I think, in probably still in the Sequoia jail for kids, which is also run by CYFD. So, these are, if it wasn't for the police body cameras, then we wouldn't have been able to, to find all of this kind of stuff. This is how a survival response I mentioned earlier, like this kind of behavior for a kid who's had like complex trauma, one trauma after another, is, it's a survival response. It's not a thought out kind of response on their part to lash out, to run, to scream, to break something. It's a fight or flight kind of thing. And especially because a lot of these these children, like with their first interaction with police are when they come to the door to take them away from their parents. And so, seeing a cop is triggering, right? Even for a kid who would have otherwise been fine, you have cases where there's uniformed police officers with tasers and pistols showing up to deal with a mental health emergency. Most of the times that we found, the cops were doing okay. I mean, they were trying their best to console the children or, to talk them down. But in some cases, they clearly made the situation worse. I mean, I think that top story with the girl in the rap restraint was one example. But this kid, you can see here, the police officers pointed their tasers at her 3 times, which is going to terrify anybody, in order to get her onto a gurney and taken to the hospital. And of course, after this, the same thing happens. She gets released because the hospitals don't hold on to you if you're not acute. You can stay there if you're actively manic or something, but once you calm down, they need to free up that bed for someone else. And so, they release them back to CYFD. CYFD still doesn't have a place for them, so they either put them in the office building or in another shelter. And so that's what happened here. One case after another. This girl had a crazy story. Her name was Mary. I won't give her last name, but she was adopted from Russia from an orphanage. This isn't in the story, it's just an aside, but she was adopted from Russia and taken to, I think, Clovis or Hobbs or somewhere in the Southeast. And at the time, we found all these, articles about this foster mother that had, adopted these kids from Russia and Ukraine, and was just, this wonderful person and, working to help these poor children. And it turns out she was, a maniacal child abuser. And so that's how the kids ended up in the foster system. She's in prison for like 30 years or something now, because she had multiple cases for each of these kids she adopted. And then, and now this girl is one of the ones who who was running from the police. She ran from the cops in this video from a shelter. The cops tried to catch her and she turned around and hit one of the police officers. And then was taken to the police station and then released back to the shelter. And then the next day, I mean, it's amazing the consistency of this pattern. And there's one instance we found with her where she was living in the office building in CYFD between these shelter placements, and she ran from the CYFD office, and the police used force in some way. They didn't attach their use of force form to the records request, so we don't know what happened. But after they had tased her or whatever and handcuffed her, she was asking if any of the police could adopt her, which I thought was really sad.
So first of all, Searchlight is a great thing. Thanks to all of you. I knew Ray Rivera back in the day. It's great that we have this investigative reporting. So there's a lot in the paper about CYFD. Of course, we just recently read that Barbara Lee Hill, maybe she just told the governor she was gonna give it 2 years and retire, but why is there no change? Why? And why is it, they had a guy, I don't know about Blaylock, but on paper, what we saw on the paper, he looked like he was reform oriented. What is wrong? Why is there no changing? What happened with the governor this past legislative session? Why didn't she? I think there was a move in the legislature to initiate some very significant reform, but she blocked it. She said she was going to do it. At least that's what was in the paper.
Yeah.
What is going on?
I mean, that's true. Blaylock came in, and everybody, kind of wrote in on the whiteboards. Everybody was so excited about him at first because he was going to change everything. He was like this kind of forward-thinking guy from the Bay Area who had all these ideas for reform. And then it ended up that he was pretty incompetent at actually managing, the department. He resigned actually because of a story that we wrote about who was using Signal, which is a secret text messaging platform. It directed the department to communicate using that and destroying public records and children's records in the process, and it became a political liability. And I think that's really the bottom line, is that it's a political liability in this department. It's so bad, it's so dysfunctional, and there are so many skeletons in the closet that it's a great thing to campaign on. And then once you're in office and you own the problem, the governor seems to think that the best thing to do is keep as short a leash on the department as she can, and keep as tight a lid as she can on this kind of thing. There were, I think, 30 child welfare bills this session, and several of them were, a lot of them were kind of fostering, but a lot of them were also, could have made a big difference. One was the Attorney General, Raul Torres, who just took office in January, wanted to create a civil rights division for children in the AG's office. Several other states have one. Kamala Harris developed a really successful one in California when she was AG there, and that would have let the agency, basically the department, the Attorney General's office, investigate CYFD for these systemic failures, not in a criminal way, but in a civil way. So they could have, compelled like a subpoena. It's not exactly a subpoena, but they could have issued what's called a civil investigative demand, produced documents, brought to light a lot of these problems, and then reach settlements or, resolve them through the legal system. And there was another one that would have had an ombudsman office in CYFD, which would have had outside accountability to the agency. And there was another bill which would have made the department share more data, that would have revised the confidentiality codes of the state, so that this, CYFD could just hide behind these laws about child privacy. But what you hear a lot is these laws are meant to protect kids, but instead they're protecting malfeasance of government officials. And so each one of those was blocked by the governor. They passed with bipartisan support, and then the governor vetoed them, which is crazy. The amount of work that goes into that's how our system is, but the amount of work that goes into one of these bills, and to get it through both chambers, especially this day and age, how tribal our politics are, to get bipartisan support for something, and then to have one person just veto it at the end seems counterproductive. Yeah.
What was I sent you an article this morning about, there is a lawyer in Bernalillo County who is suing CYFD to freeze some of that.
Yeah, I spoke to him.
Address that.
I spoke to him before he filed that suit. He called me and was wanted to talk about it, and ended up going a different way with the lawsuit. But he thinks that he has a clear case where the confidentiality rules are putting a specific kid in danger, and that he can use that case to force some sort of change through the courts. But that's what we're faced with, is long shot legal cases, because he thinks that Oliver, you can come in. This is my boy.
Oh.
Because like I said, I think the governor wants to it's in her political agenda. Now I'm speaking for her, so this could be off, but this is my interpretation is that, you know, having any sort of outside accountability that she can't control, that her office can't control, is just going to bring a lot of new scandals that, you know, no politician wants. I think that's the problem that we're in. I mean, would have been great. I think maybe if all this had happened like in the first legislative session or all these bills, when she had just come, and she could pin everything on Susana Martinez, maybe it would have been different. But that's not how things materialized. You know, we got a big rush of energy to change these kinds of things, and they just didn't go anywhere. So I wish it was a happy ending, but it is something that's like a perennial, you know, an issue here, right? Like people are always charged up about how bad things are for kids, and this agency sometimes unfairly, but a lot of times fairly gets the blame for a lot of it. And so it's gonna, I don't think there's, you know, there's gonna be more bills like this in the future.
What do you think we can do?
That's a good question. I mean, if it was a legislative session, you know, you could you know, have spoken, you know, in support of bills or something like that. I wish I had a better answer. You know, in journalism, we're not really part of the advocacy community, right? We don't like get directly involved in pushing for a change, but we show the problem, right? And then leave that to other people. There are a lot of organizations, you know, in the state that CASAs are a great way, probably place to start. CASA, I think, First Judicial District is in Santa Fe. And they are the organization that basically, they're court-appointed special advocates, so you might have a better definition for them, but they are, they advocate for the children as part of the court process, right? So they're interacting directly with the kids. And a lot of times they have volunteer opportunities, they have, you know, open houses and stuff like that. They're not lawyers, but they're kind of citizen advocates that are part of the process of the child welfare system. There are nonprofits like the Mexico Child First Network and others that are always, you know, pushing for this kinds of change. And they might have some things to do, but I wish I had a better kind of like list of ways to get involved. That would have been something good for me to bring. But, you know, maybe I can send an email later or something. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, is the problem being exempt increased because of lack of facilities? Or, you know, the house that people are at, is it a lack of a sufficient mental health staff to help them? Is it financial? Or, my guess is it's all of the above. But if I remember correctly, in this last legislature, CYFD kind of got the short end of the budget process. I think the person just turned over it or whatever. I don't know, it seems like there needs to be a multi-pronged attack at these issues to try to solve the problem. How can that be done, or is it being done? And how successful is it, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think it's a budget for the department issue. I mean, they last year reverted like $11 million to the general fund that they hadn't spent. It's not that, it's just they don't have money. They have done a terrible job at fulfilling the settlement agreement for Kevin S. That I think would have solved a lot of these problems. Now, like there's a Kevin S. Well, you can just go to the website. I was going to type it in, but it's not a very interesting website to look at, but you can see a lot about the settlement. They, you know, in a painstaking way, like a panel of experts and attorneys and all kinds of other people really put a roadmap to fixing all these problems. And so the answer is there. It's not like we don't have an answer. It's just that the state hasn't, hasn't done its part. And what I am afraid of is that, we have a pattern in New Mexico of having some sort of settlement agreement, that the state agrees to, and it's this huge thing, and then it never gets fulfilled. That happened all the way back in the 90s with the Deborah Hatton Gonzalez case and against HSD, Human Services Department. Like a single mother who was like a janitor or something wasn't able to get her benefits that she was eligible for, federal benefits, because there were too many barriers at the state level to accessing them. So whatever court was overseeing that, ruled that New Mexico had to reform its human services division to make, low-income people get their benefits better. That was in the 90s, and we still haven't complied with it. There was the Yazzie Martinez case against the Department of Education, the Public Education Department, when was that, like 8 or 9 years ago or something now? And that is still, I mean, they've made some steps, you know what I mean? And that one is a little more successful than others, but they're still a long way from finishing it. And now we have one at CYFD that could really, solve a lot of these problems, but there's a possibility that we'll just, indefinitely not comply, and there's not much that really can happen.
Nat, go ahead.
Excuse me, I was just going to bring up the year-round, the interim, and we have an unpaid legislature. Just be at the interim, speak up during the interim, have coffees with your senators and representatives, and I was often wonder, how much impact does it have? But we're even looking at the Jackson lawsuit. Did that make enough of a difference? I think you're right. These very expensive, intensive, work-intensive, labor-intensive, but not results-intensive lawsuits. And then how do we continue to plug away at making sure that the change and becomes a efficacy that creates the change to the system that actually helps the most vulnerable populations? I don't know what the answer is. Someone was asking me the other day, well, which one of those committees was it that you made that public comment that was so relevant? It's like, well, which of the 70 meetings during the interim and even hundreds during the session to testify or make public comment or support or oppose bills makes a difference? I go, well, how can you be at like 300 meetings a year? It's like, I don't know. I wish it made 300 times the difference I wanted it to.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about state government is that it actually you do have more access to your local senator and congressman or congresswoman than, you would federally. And even federally, Martin Heinrich is always holding mobile office hours and answering letters to people. I wonder if he might run for governor. I don't know if that's, he hasn't signaled that in any way, but, there are people who can continue to exert pressure either in the state house or Senate or, the US senators and congressmen, actually all congresswomen in New Mexico.
To be honest, I have to say, I text a lot of sitting legislators during committee and say, there's this factoid, there's that factoid, because they're juggling the balls in the air for everything. And sometimes that little factoid, get cell phone numbers of your leadership and watch the hearing. And if there's a factoid that you think will be relevant to get that vote across the finish line, text it. It's just information. We hope that information gets used. What can we do? I think is the big question. And I think you've given a lot of enormous facts that we need to just keep placing in front of leadership. Like your article alone is a treasure trove of facts. How do we make those facts still have the not shock value because anyone's trying to shock anyone, just the shock that this is real. This is what happened. The fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are the realities. How do we recognize why someone is doing that? Because the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn, the fawn piece was when the young woman asked the police, "Can you adopt me?" Which is, I'll do whatever you want if you just get me out of this nightmare. That's fawning to the very entity that you're now extremely fearful of.
Yeah.
I, maybe others can comment, but, so I've been involved quite a bit with the public schools here, and I just listened in the school board meeting on the current budget, and then I realized it's sort of like a thunderclap. I don't think the budgets in the state are tied to outcomes, so there's never any accountability. So what you get is you get a bill and it put, requesting X amount of money into X program. But it's never tied to, in 1 year, these are our outcome measures if this program succeeds. Now, I don't know if other states do it differently. I think it's probably the same with CYFD. There's always, we need to do this, we need to do that, but then the follow-up, the accountability is missing.
Yeah, and they also have a big problem with that department is just the incredible rate of turnover. I mean, not just with their leadership, they've lost 2 secretaries and 2 deputy secretaries in the last 5 years, I think. But their social workers, I mean, the people that are on the ground, and I couldn't do this work without sources within the department. So I don't want to demonize the entire agency where there's a lot of people who are willing to take a job that pays like, $40,000 to do incredibly difficult work. A lot of these people just love kids and want to help, but they're in a dysfunctional system. I mean, the only people that stay around are these middle managers that, never have any accountability. And in some cases should be fired and then never are. In some cases are promoted. People at the top and people at the bottom are always leaving. It's just hard to, even if there was any sort of outcome driven, budget requirement, I don't see how they could, with the way that it's structured now, how they could meet those outcomes.
Well, that's the whole point, is that if they had the outcomes, if you have a continuous improvement climate, then you just look at the problem and say, well, what can we do better next time? It's not to have the outcomes to tear anything down, it's to keep improving. But the amount of data that's available, just say to a parent, even in our own school district, on what's happening in a school and reading and math, I mean, it's very, very limited.
Yeah, but it's more than the child welfare system. I mean, there's a lot more reporting requirements to federal Department of Education and the state by the school districts than there are for the foster system. I mean, and what does get reported is secret. So it's just a black box, and we only see the problems when there's an explosive news story that either an investigation like this or something where a kid dies or it's so badly beaten, there's a police press conference or a press release in the state, it's in those extreme levels, the state loses control of the ability to keep the information.
It's incredible that you got that 911 data. That was just brilliant that you found you could access that, but yeah,
it took a year. It took a year and a team of professional journalists to get it, right? So most parents, if you have a kid in the foster system or a relative, they can't do that. You know what I mean? For their kid, and it's very difficult.
I'm just gonna say that we found in CASA that the CASA person lasted longer than any of the social.
What do you think that says?
I think the social workers felt depressed. They could not make it. It was an impossible situation.
And what would you do? If you were a social worker, I'd probably refer a kid to a shelter too. I would hope that I'd share all the information about the kid, but a shelter is better than an office. It's better than under a bridge or out on the streets where they could be in all kinds of danger. They just don't have anywhere to put these kids.
It's like trying, when I worked with the mental health system in Colorado, it's like, this is a hot potato. I can't deal with it. I'll pop it over to the police. The police pop it over to the urgent care or ER. And you're just continually, this person, you're popping, over, trying to get into another system because you don't think your system has the ability to help. And that's where I really felt the agencies needed to work together to solve, try to work on one case at a time to try to solve, that they spent their time trying to throw the cases at one another.
Are there, I thought the suggestion about using this interim period to go to our legislators is a good idea. Are there any in particular that you think are particularly engaged in the CYFD issues?
Yeah, Jerry Ortiz Pino is always, he has, I can't remember his maybe position, but there's a lot of times support, is behind some of these child welfare laws. Javier Martinez, I think, is the House Speaker. And he also is involved in a lot of this stuff. But actually, it's a bipartisan issue. Stephanie Lord is a Republican. That was introduced to Christy Diamond, another Republican. I don't know which ones are in our district and where you live, but there are, what you could do is, look at I think the journal has like a breakdown of all of those that were introduced and failed, and see the people that sponsored them. Mirabel Moya, I think, was another Republican. I mean, it takes a lot to, to get something that both parties can agree on. This seems to be one of them, but still, that only gets you so far when the governor just vetoes the things that you get through. So, but yeah, I would maybe go, the names that I gave you are a good place to start, but like, look at who filed those bills and, the ones that were passed. And the sponsor should be on that, breakdown that the journal has. I'm sure the next one has something too, but I think the journal did a more comprehensive, like, what passed and what failed. I think we're out of time. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope this was helpful. And you can subscribe to our newsletter on Searchlight. If you want to keep seeing these stories, just go to our website and there's like a little newsletter tab. That's a good way to keep up with what we're doing. I'll have more stories out in the next couple of weeks about this. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.